Welcome to Frank+Buckley Interviews. Today, a man who has made it his mission in life to free prisoners who are serving time for crimes they did not commit. And he's had some high-profile success. My guest is Justin+Brooks, director of the California Innocence Project.
Frank+Buckley Interviews starts now.
Justin+Brooks has helped dozens of prisoners to walk free after they were wrongfully convicted. Among them, Brian Banks, a USC-bound football player convicted of rape, a rape he didn't commit.
Brian was a 16-year-old kid that had his whole life ahead of him, just mapped out. You're going to USC, you're going to play ball, and you're going to make it in the NFL. That's what everybody thought. And as a junior in high school, he was one of the best linebackers in the country. And then this classmate accuses him of rape, and it's all over.
Justin+Brooks of the California Innocence Project, taking us inside the fight to free the wrongfully convicted when we come back. Justin, thanks for being here.
Sure.
You have made it your life's mission to free those prisoners who've been wrongfully convicted. And it made me think, why are so many people behind bars who shouldn't be?
Right. Well, there are many, many reasons. This work started for me 25 years ago when I read about a 21-year-old woman on death row in Chicago, and she was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. So I thought, how can anyone be sentenced to death on a plea bargain? And I went to meet with her on death row and said, how did you end up here? And she said, well, my lawyer told me the best thing to do was to plead guilty, and I'd probably get a better result than going to trial. So I said, you got the death penalty, you got the worst possible result, and he had never even negotiated a plea bargain with the prosecutor, just pled her straight up. And then she told me an amazing thing. She said, and I'm innocent. So I was teaching law school in Michigan. I went back and talked to my class about it and said, there's this 21-year-old sitting on death row. She's got a date for execution. She's going to be executed, and she's telling me she's innocent. Who wants to help out on this? And over the next few years, basically the Innocence Project was born for me. That we sat in my kitchen and worked on the case. We investigated the crime scene, talked to the witnesses, and discovered that she was factually innocent. And that's what, after that, I moved to California and I started the California Innocence Project in 1999. Since then, the number one cause that I found of innocent people going to prison has been misidentifications. And it's basically because when a witness walks in a courtroom and says, I'm 100% sure that's the person who committed the crime, that's enough to get you convicted. And we've learned over the years that it's not really good evidence.
Yeah, it's notoriously unreliable. We all know this now. So many experts have come forward to show us empirically that what we think we see isn't always what has happened.
Right.
Or that the person you've identified, who you are convinced is the person, isn't the person.
Right.
And yet the courts seem to continue to accept that sort of testimony.
Courts and jurors, I always try to educate jurors on that issue, and I use the simple example of, have you ever been in a restaurant and you look right at a waiter or waitress in their face, and there's a bright light, and no one has a gun in your face, you're not afraid, and you do your order, and say you order broccoli cheese soup, and a few minutes later you think, no, I'm going to have the mushroom soup, and you turn around and think, which one was my waiter? And I think almost everyone has experienced that, and that's the best possible identification position you could be in. It's just a few minutes later, you're not under stress. Yet I see cases where people are making identifications hours later, days later, weeks later, months later, and those are being admitted into court, and jurors are believing them. And we've got serious problems with the procedures we use. And most troubling in California is that Los Angeles County, the largest county in America, still is using archaic identification procedures, even though study after study after study has shown that they're not doing it correctly.
But we want the bad guy behind bars. If that person committed a murder or whatever the crime is, we want that person behind bars. Isn't there some check on that so that at some point, okay, person number 3 has been identified, but then the detectives will look into person 3's life and realize that, person 3 didn't do it. How come person 3 still gets convicted?
Yeah, what you just said is really interesting in the part of we want to get the bad guys. And that's what's always discouraging to me is when we don't see reforms that aren't towards the defense, they're towards getting it right. right? So if we want to get the bad guys, we should do the best possible identification
Yeah.
procedures we can. If we want the jury to see that a confession is voluntary, let's video it. And now you can show the jury, hey, look, we offered this guy tea and coffee, and he confessed to killing his wife. It was that straightforward.
Yeah.
This is all nonsense they're talking about how he was pressured and all that. I always say transparency is the best policy, so we can see the truth.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally what the innocence movement's all about and what the California Innocence Project's all about. It's about getting to the truth.
There are a couple of, you've worked on so many cases, and there have been 2,000 documented cases of wrongfully convicted folks in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And those are just the documented ones,
Yeah,
obviously.
more than 2,000 now,
Yeah.
yeah.
When you get these folks in front of a jury, well, let's do this. Let's talk about a couple of the most recent ones that folks may be familiar with.
Sure.
Horace Roberts was one of them here in
Mhm.
Southern California.
Yep.
Spent 20 years in prison. Why was he in prison, and what did you guys do about it?
So Horace was, all these cases are sad. He ended up getting convicted basically because he lied about having an affair with the victim. So when she turned up dead, the police went to his house to ask him about her, and he lied about it. He was working with her. They were having an affair. He didn't want people to know about it. And as a result, the police focused on him, even though it made absolutely no sense when you look at the facts. She was found with his truck, or just near his truck on the side of the highway, and she had borrowed his truck. And the truck was sitting there by the highway fully operable. So when I first looked at that case, I said, why would this guy murder her, leave her body by the side of the road, and then leave his truck there, and then walk away from this crime scene on the side of a highway? And then he's actually videoed in this convenience store not long thereafter, and Usain Bolt couldn't have got there as quickly as he got there. But the police, as they often do, they got tunnel vision. They find a guy who's lying, and then the jury looks at it, and they see a guy who's lying, and they see they're having an affair, and they all miss the most obvious suspect, which was her husband. And she was openly having this affair, and he had motive. And so Horace goes to prison for 20 years. Ultimately, we were able to prove him innocent by using DNA from the crime scene, which we were able to link back to the husband and an accomplice. But it took us many, many years to win that case.
You say 6,000 people come to you every year saying, I'm wrongfully convicted. Please look at my case.
Yep.
Do you have any sense of the righteousness of those 6,000 cases? What percentage is actually, are these folks actually wrongfully convicted?
Right. It's impossible to know. The majority of the cases I close because there's no way to develop evidence of their innocence without me even taking a position as to whether they're innocent or not. I mean, for example, the classic one is very typical in LA. I was in the car, I didn't know he had a gun, and he pulls it out and starts firing at some kids. And you get all these gang cases where it's I didn't have knowledge, or drug cases. I was at the party, I didn't know there was cocaine there. The problem with those cases, they're not winnable. If the jury didn't believe you the first time around, there's nothing I can do about that case unless you've come up with some video from an ATM machine that proves definitively. So there's a whole bunch of them where they very well may be factually innocent, but we just can't prove it. I'm sure there's a certain percentage of people who are guilty who write to me and have just thrown the spaghetti against the wall.
Yeah.
Probably what I would do too if I was in prison. So it's hard to break those numbers down. But what we do know, there's some shocking statistics of what we do know. And one thing we know, for example, is that 4% of the people on death row in the United States have been released after finding they're innocent.
4%,
4%
on death row released.
So we know that in the cases that got the most scrutiny, the most media attention, the most assistance on the defense side, the most assistance on the prosecution side, the cases that are highlighted every day, not some simple drug case in some small county, but a death penalty case, that we still got it wrong at a minimum of 4%, because those 4% are the lucky ones that there was still evidence that existed that could prove they were innocent, and somebody listened and filed paperwork, and they hadn't been procedurally barred, and a judge granted a hearing, and they were able to develop the evidence. It's always hard for me to tell my clients they're the lucky ones, but they are.
Yeah.
And so that is a shocking statistic to me, and enough for us not to have the death penalty in America, for example. Our system isn't good enough. It's not good enough to give it that kind of power.
That's 4 in every 100 people,
Correct.
if you look at it that
have been
way.
released from death row and not downgraded to manslaughter or not downgraded to life sentence, walked off death row. And in fact, when I worked in Chicago, we had as many people who walked off death row as were executed. So I could literally turn to a client and say, good news, bad news. Bad news is you've been sentenced to death. Good news, 50-50, you're going home. That's how bad the numbers were.
My goodness. I would imagine part of that is because if you're putting someone away for many years, you will have to be convinced of your position going in. The victim, the victim's family, the police officers, the detectives, the prosecuting attorneys, they all believe they've got the bad guy.
Right.
And so tell me about the process of talking to each one of those shareholders, starting from the victims. They are the most affected by this, and they believe that the police have got the bad guy. You can't let the bad guy go.
Yeah.
How do you talk to them?
That's a great question, and something I've struggled with throughout my whole career. I feel like I'm better at it now than I was 30 years ago. But I would say it starts with, when we roll into a small town in California, there's going to be defensiveness. Like, we're coming in, and this could be a case that a prosecutor made their career on, spent 3 years on. And when you're at a barbecue, people don't even like you telling them how to flip a burger, right?
Yeah.
And here I am to come in and say, police officers, you got it wrong. Prosecutor, you got it wrong. Presiding judge, you got it wrong. And victims, they got the wrong person. And so all that pain that you had, now we're going to open it all back up. It is a horrible situation. So I absolutely get the psychology of that. And what I try to do is try to say, this isn't about people making mistakes, unless they did, right? So we had a case in Ventura County, a guy named Mike Hanline, who was in prison for 36 years, which at that time was the longest in the history of California, wrongfully convicted. And he was set up. I mean, he was basically set up by a number of people there. But in a lot of these cases, it's just a victim has made an identification. They think they got it right. We come in with DNA evidence to show they actually got it wrong. And people did the best they could at their job. And so when I can, I try to frame it like that. But it is a battle. It is very tough.
Let's talk about another case that you're well known for, and that's the Brian Banks case.
Sure.
Many people in Southern California know this case. Brian was a promising football player in Long Beach in high school. He's committed to play at USC. What happened next?
Brian was a 16-year-old kid that had his whole life ahead of him, just mapped out. You're going to USC, you're going to play ball, and you're going to make it in the NFL. That's what everybody thought. And as a junior in high school, he was one of the best linebackers in the country. And then this classmate accuses him of rape, and it's all over. He ends up getting arrested. He spends a year in a juvenile detention facility. And then on the day of trial, his lawyer comes to him and says, I got a deal for you. You got to take it. If you take this deal, I might be able to get you probation. You'll be back in high school, back playing football. If you don't take this deal, you're looking at 41 years to life. You're looking at dying in prison. Brian starts crying. He doesn't know what to do. He says, can I talk to my parents? And she says, no. You got to make this decision right now. And so this is what's happened in the criminal justice system. It's become basically a casino because 95% of cases are pled out. And the whole system sort of conspires to push you towards a plea bargain because we can't afford to try all these cases. He takes the deal. He doesn't get probation. He gets the maximum sentence. He goes to prison for 6 years. And then when he gets out, he gets a Facebook friend request one day from this girl. And she says, can we let bygones be bygones? I'm sorry about all that stuff that happened in high school. Sorry I made up that you kidnapped and raped me.
Sorry, I made it up.
Yeah. And still, even with that, her coming forward, it was a battle to get him exonerated. Brian ended up videoing her, saying exactly that she was never raped, she was never kidnapped. But since there was a plea bargain, it's very hard to unring that bell. Fortunately, I got the LA District Attorney Office to cooperate in an investigation. We jointly investigated it. We finally got her into a room to question her about it. She'd basically forgotten the lies she'd told. And so as she tried to recreate them, there were so many inconsistencies that ultimately we were able to get his case dismissed. And the day we walked him out, I stood on the steps of the courthouse and said, this kid can still play football. NFL coaches give me a call. And amazingly, they started calling. And Brian flew around the country doing NFL tryouts. He didn't make a team. He ended up moving in with me and my family. We got him a trainer. He spent a year training and then ultimately was with the Atlanta Falcons for a short period of time. It's an amazing story. And for me, it was heartbreaking because so many of my clients, they don't have great lives to start with. You know, they come from situations where things aren't great. But here was Brian, this kid who had everything in front of him.
Yeah.
And it was just taken away from him. And it was important to me to try get some of his dreams back, not just get him back to a normal job, but get some of his dreams back. And we were able to do that.
You've been trying for years to help 12 people in particular who are representative of what's happening in California, the California 12. Tell us what the status is of those 12 individuals.
Sure. So 6 years ago, I got the crazy idea that I would file clemency petitions for 12 of our clients that were most deserving of clemency. And to get the governor's attention, I would walk those clemency petitions from San Diego to Sacramento.
712 miles?
It ended up being, at first I thought it was only 500 miles, but
Right.
You can't walk the way the birds fly.
Right.
So I went to work the next day. I thought my staff would talk me out of it, and instead they said, that's a great idea, boss. You should definitely do that.
Right.
And two of them volunteered to come with me, Alyssa Biricol and Mike Samanchik. And so we walked for 50 days across the state, carrying those clemency petitions. We did a ton of rallies, speaking engagements to raise awareness of wrongful conviction. We filed them with the governor, and for the past 6 years, up until last week when he left office, I tweeted to him every single day asking him to consider those clemency petitions. Ultimately, he only considered 2 of them, and he reduced those sentences to make those people parolable. And it was really unsatisfactory. These were compelling cases of innocence, and as the years went on, we were actually successful in litigating 5 of those cases and getting them free on our own without the governor's help. And every time we got one out, I kept thinking, now he's going to realize these are really innocent people. And now he's going to realize these are really innocent people. But he didn't do it. And the governor really focused on people who had remorse and people who had reformed themselves.
How can you have remorse if you didn't commit the crime?
Exactly. That was the frustration I kept saying. They haven't committed the crime. The governor knows there are innocent people in prison. We know there's 2,000 documented cases of wrongful convictions. We know now that they're innocent people. So why are we talking about this? Here's the evidence. Go to the prison, meet with my client. I'll bring the witnesses up here. I'll present all the evidence to you. And we were never given an opportunity to do that. And ultimately, he left office with just 2 of those sentences being reduced. So I'm still fighting for 5 more of them to get out of prison.
Let me take the other side for a second.
Sure.
And these are folks who will say, look, you know, we're glad that you're doing what you're doing, but chances are if people are being convicted of a crime and it's a close call, they were probably in the wrong place and they probably have a criminal record or they shouldn't be there. And so even if you convict them of this and maybe they didn't do this one, they probably did something else over here. To them, you would say what?
Well, I think sometimes that's true. You know, I really try to be a reasonable person. Like I always say, there's 2 unreasonable positions. One is that everyone in prison is innocent. That's unreasonable.
Yeah.
It's also unreasonable everyone in prison is guilty. Most people in prison are guilty. Absolutely accept that. And then it's how many are innocent that we can figure it out. And it's true that some of the people who've been exonerated had prior crimes, and that's how they ended up in the photo array. That's how they ended up in a situation that maybe you or I would, in our situations, not be in. But if you look at the stories, there's many, many people in there who never had anything to do with the criminal justice system. Kim Long, she's a white middle-class nurse. She comes home one day, finds her boyfriend beaten to death. Really terrible forensic work is done. She doesn't get good enough lawyering, and she goes to prison for 8 years. Bill Richards, he's an engineer. He comes home one day, finds his wife dead. He ends up being convicted of it, does 23 years in prison. I represented both of them. And it can just happen. We don't want to accept that.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this question. You spend so much time scrutinizing the work of other lawyers, prosecutors, judges, police, to make sure that they have done the right thing. And then you point out when they have done the wrong thing.
Right.
Have you ever taken on a case thinking this person is wrongfully convicted, argued your brains out, and then realized at the end, I was wrong?
Well, what has happened is we've had a number of cases where, for example, we know that DNA evidence will prove whether they're innocent or guilty. And I've got a whole little come to Jesus speech that I give in the prison to the client saying, hey, if you're guilty, don't have me do this DNA test. This is a definite thing, and you're never getting out of here if this comes back as you. Because now it's that you've lied the whole time, and then you've wasted everyone's time, and the DA is going to be involved in this, and I'll guarantee you they're going to show up at your parole hearings and make sure you don't get parole. And a few times they've said to me, don't do the test. Most of the time they say do the test. And a couple of times they've said do the test, and it's come back a match to them, where they were just taking a shot. So it does happen. What's never happened is that I've filed the evidence to go in and say we've got enough here to prove innocence, and got someone exonerated where they're ultimately guilty. It won't happen because the standard is just too high. We have to definitively show they're innocent and that we've got proof of it in order to get an exoneration.
All right. Justin, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to know more about the California Innocence Project, or you'd like to hear more of my conversation with Justin Brooks, check out the Frank Buckley Interviews podcast. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts. We've got more than 130 conversations in our archives. It's always free to listen. If you'd like to share today's conversation with friends and family, find us on YouTube. Search for Frank Buckley Interviews Justin Brooks. We appreciate your feedback on social media. I'm Frank Buckley TV on Twitter and on Instagram, and there's a Frank Buckley Facebook page as well. I read all of your comments. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.